worms. Oh my. What do these all have in common? They are called invasive species. And why are they so bothersome? That's what we're going to find out about tonight. An invasive species, according to the Wisconsin statute, defines it as a non-indigenous species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Humans move organisms around all the time. Sometimes when we bring a non-native species into a new area, that species will take over and spread rapidly and widely throughout the area. When this happens, the spread can cause major harm to the native ecosystem or to human beings. When non-native plants, animals, or pathogens rapidly take over a new location and alter the ecosystem, we consider them invasive species. And we have many different kinds of invasive species. There are insects, aquatic life, plants, diseases. There's a whole variety of things. But the thing that is important to remember, they are able to succeed because they often leave behind their predators and their competitors in their native ecosystems. And without these natural checks and balances, they're able to reproduce rapidly and outcompete native species. Invasive species can alter ecological relationships among native species and can also affect ecosystem function, the economic value of ecosystems, and human health. Native plants, animals, and insects have natural controls or predators that keep the number of a species under control. You can think about the balance between foxes and rabbits or wolves and deer. When a natural predator is no longer there, the population of a species multiplies out of control. When wolves were no longer in Wisconsin, the deer population had to be controlled in another way. If a fox leaves your neighborhood, you are likely to have a surge of rabbits eating your landscape. Insects and birds are another example. Now, a new insect moves in and native birds do not recognize it as food, so it goes unchecked. And that's what happens with many of our invasive insects. That new insect has the run of the environment because nothing will stop it from multiplying. This is true of two of the species we are going to look at. We're going to talk a little bit later about buckthorn, which is an invasive plant. It's a good example of a non-native species taking over the landscape. It readily outcompetes native plants because it leaves out earlier in the spring, stays green later in the fall. If you're out where there's buckthorn right now, it will still have green leaves, even though most of our native plants, the leaves have fallen off. Its fruits are diarrhea-inducing in birds that eat them and weaken the bird's health, as well as making sure that the seeds are spread far and wide. Many invasive species also produce huge numbers of seeds, 1,000 or more on a single plant that can survive for years in the soil, as opposed to a much smaller number in native plants. Some have extensive underground root systems that invade its neighbors' spaces and are hard to kill by pulling, burning, or digging up. So we're going to try to focus a little bit more on some of the insects, but those are some general things when an invasive species moves into a new area. How do they get here? Humans have created conditions where plants and animals can aggressively invade and dominate natural areas and water bodies in three ways. We have introduced a lot of these species on purpose from other regions or other countries, and they come here and they're no longer have competitors or predators. I think of many of the plants. Buckthorn was one that was brought in here as a landscape plant. Burning bush, Japanese barberry, almost all of the plants that we have that have a name from somewhere else, like Japanese or Chinese or Asian or European something, those were purposely brought here for a reason. And sometimes we have not always researched to look at what that species is going to do once you leave its native environment. We can also have invasive species here that disrupt the balance of the native ecosystems by changing the ecological and environmental conditions. For example, we have streams that fill in, we do ditching, we build roads, we restrict or eliminate natural processes. For example, we don't suppress fire, or we do suppress fire so that the native fires that would normally control an environment are no longer happening. And sometimes the native plants and animals can also become invasive when we disrupt their ecosystem. And then there's a spreading of native species once they get here by various different methods. For example, many of the water plants and invertebrates and things are spread by moving watercraft from one water body to another without checking that you have emptied your bait buckets and that you've emptied your wells and you've scrubbed the bottoms of your boats, or at least looked at them. You might get the invasive species on the tires or the boat trailer and carry it to another place. Sometimes those invasive plants are spread on footwear or on pets' furs or animal furs. By mowing along roadsides, when you mow, you sort of spew everything in all directions, and that spreads it rather quickly. One of the ones we're going to talk about, the emerald ash borer, has been spread widely by importing firewood and leaving it in campgrounds. Driving and biking and ATVs and that sort of thing also spread these seeds once they're here, because they get in the tire treads and on the mud that are on these vehicles. So when we look at the result of all of this, the net loss of diversity of our native plants and animals as invasive species rapidly multiply and take over. About 42% of the species that are on the federal endangered or threatened species list are at risk primarily because a native species has invaded the area. Some of the things that we're trying to do to stop this, I don't know if you've ever been traveling and you get to a country and when you go through customs, they take away your fruit or they take away some seeds or something that you may have wanted to bring home. These are all ways that we're trying to stop some of these invasive things from coming into our country. Some of you might remember the problem of zebra mussels when it first became a problem in the Great Lakes. They are believed to have entered the lakes when the ship's ballast water was emptied in the lakes. It was taken on in another port, and it now transfers the mussels to the Great Lakes area. And once it is there, then we move it around. So that's why it's become a very big problem. Okay, let's take a look at some of the things that were in the title, and that's probably why a lot of you tuned in to this program tonight and what you can do about them. Japanese beetles, native, of course, to Japan. That's why they're called Japanese beetles. They are found in all states east of the Mississippi, and they have now moved to some states that are west of the river. The first recorded incidence of them is in 1916 in New Jersey, and they probably came in on imported plants. Like so many of our invasive species, they hitchhike in by other means. We don't bring them in directly and spread them a lot of times. This beetle likes moderate temperatures and precipitation, so Wisconsin is an ideal place for it. Not too hot, not too cold, enough precipitation, not too dry. The adults, unfortunately, eat over 300 plants and trees. And you can see in the picture here, when they've attacked something, all that's left are the veins of the leaves usually, and it looks like a lacy skeleton of a leaf. The adults usually start at the top of plants with the top leaves first and work their way down. They are capable of killing some susceptible plants. Sometimes the damage is great on a plant, sometimes not. Sometimes it's more aesthetic. I've had terrible Japanese beetles the last couple of years on my beans, yet the beans keep producing until frost. So I don't know how they do it when there's hardly any leaves on them. But sometimes the Japanese beetles will actually kill it. We had a very sizable linden tree, basswood tree on our boulevard, and it was defoliated completely 2 years by the Japanese beetles. And the third year it did not come back. So sometimes it's more cosmetic because they eat the petals on flowers, so the plants don't look nice anymore, even though the plant is surviving. The reason you have it is for the pretty flowers, and those are no longer present because the Japanese beetles have done their damage. They prefer to feed on warm, sunny afternoons, and the grubs or the larvae of this beetle feed on the roots of turf and other ornamental plants. So it kind of attacks in two ways, but the most noticeable damage is on the leaves of plants. This is the Japanese beetle life cycle. We're going to start in June, right in the middle. Late June, early July is usually when the beetles start to emerge from the ground. And they emerge, they fly around, they mate, they eat all your good stuff. And then once they have mated, the females dig down into the ground and lay their eggs. The eggs then hatch into grubs, which feed on the roots of plants and grass, turf. And when it gets to be cold in the wintertime, about this time of the year, they start to burrow down farther deeper into the soil. And they stay there until about February or early March, and then they start gradually coming up to the surface as the ground warms up, and they pupate for a brief time in about May and early June, and then the cycle starts over again when the adults emerge in late June and early July. So there's damage in two ways from the Japanese beetles. Controls. Unfortunately, they are not easy to control. You can leave them alone and provide support for the affected plants like trees, making sure they have enough water, nutrients, and that sort of thing. Mulching the ground underneath the trees. If you have smaller plants, you can cover them up. But again, that's maybe not a good solution if you have roses, because you want people to see them, and then you cover them up to keep the Japanese beetles off. You can't see the roses anymore. One way to control the numbers is to hand pick and drop them in a bucket or a jar of soapy water. They are less active in the morning. So if you're going out to hand pick them, you have a better chance of sneaking up on them earlier in the day. As the day warms up, they get more active. And when they sense that you are there, they are likely to fly off. By the way, they can fly quite a distance, up to 5 miles. You can use some insecticides, Bacillus thuringiensis, Galeriae, or BTG. It's the active ingredient in beetle gone. And also azadirachtin and pyrethrins are effective against the Japanese beetle adults. We can use chlorantraniliprole. It's an active ingredient in the word you see there. Synthetic compounds in the pyrethroid class of insecticides are also effective. However, if you're using these, you have to be careful because they are also harmful to many other insects and pollinators. So you can't spray flowering plants with these if you have pollinators present without also killing the pollinators. Be sure that you use them as directed. Check that they are safe for fruits and vegetables if you're spraying it on those kinds of plants. Some you can eat, some have a waiting period before you can eat the vegetables that you have sprayed. And basically, when you're looking at insecticides, be sure you read the label and follow it. Some of these are not very long lasting, which means you have to spray quite often. And is the cost and the time you spent doing that worth it to save your plants, or are you just going to try to live with them and do some hand picking in order to control them? Some of their favorite plants are Norway and Japanese maple, birch, crabapple, purple leaf plum, rose, mountain ash, linden, grapes, and basil. They generally like those plants best, but like I said, they'll eat anything that's available at any time. The other thing that you want to look at controlling is grub control. Now, this is only necessary if you actually see damage to your lawn. So if you think you're going to go out there and apply grub control and solve the problem of having Japanese beetles in your yard, that's not going to happen. The grub control needs to be applied soon after the egg laying begins to be effective. So that means July and August. If you want to discourage the grubs from entering the ground or from the beetles from laying eggs in your lawn, avoid watering your lawn in July to about mid to late August, because they don't like to lay eggs where the ground is dry. That the eggs may not hatch, and if they do hatch, the larva may not survive because it's too dry. They need moisture. You will know that you have grub damage in a couple different ways. The grass will just die in certain areas, and if you pull up that dead sod, you will see the grubs underneath. Be sure that you are actually have grubs before you treat your lawn. There are two resources listed in the resource list: white grub control in turf grass and conservation of native and domestic pollinators in managed turf grass landscapes. Those are listed on the resource list, and you can log on. These are both publications of the DNR and or the UW Extension and UW Horticulture websites. So let's see, in my notes here. If you wait too long in the fall to apply the grub control, the beetles have started to go down into the lower areas in the lawn, down into the soil, and so it won't be effective either. Oh, another way you can tell if you have grubs is you may have things like skunks and that sort of thing digging up your lawn to get at the grubs. That's probably a better indicator that you have grubs, and at that point you may want to be treating the grubs. As I said, treating the turf is useless unless it's showing grub damage, and those beetles can fly quite a ways. Traps are also ineffective. You see a lot of them in the landscape, and it makes people feel good that they're catching all these beetles. But one of the things that is happening is the beetles are attracted to this area, but they sort of get waylaid on the way to the trap and end up in your vegetables and trees anyway. There are two different pheromones that are used in those traps. One is a sexual attractant, and the other one is a scent that will attract the beetles to foliage that's been eaten on or nibbled on. And so they're either saying, here I am ready to mate, or I found a great dining area. And they've done studies that more beetles are attracted to your yard than are actually caught in the trap. And so, like I said, they get waylaid on the way to the trap and never make it to the trap. So unfortunately, there's not really good news about Japanese beetles and easy solutions to control. And this is true for most of the things we're talking about tonight. The second one we're going to look at is the emerald ash borer. It's a small metallic green insect. It's only 3/8 to 1/2 inch long, and you probably will never see the adults. The They can fly up to a half mile from their hatch site. So their progress is really slow, except we've really accelerated it by moving wood, particularly like firewood and that sort of thing, from one location to another. The D-shaped exit hole in the top right, if you see a lot of these on your tree and the tree is also not looking very healthy, you probably have the Japanese beetles. If you were to strip away the bark of the tree, you would find that larva that you see in the lower left-hand corner. It's kind of white, kind of a segmented looking little creature. And this just destroys the tree by eating through the bark from when the egg is laid. And it goes into, there's a very narrow layer between the bark and the heartwood of a tree. It's called the cambium layer. And this is where all the passageways are, where the water goes up to the tree leaves and the food comes down and vice versa. And when they eat through that, they cut through all those water conducting tubes, sort of to think. And so it cuts off the nutrition to the tree and the water. On the lower right-hand side, you can see when the tree dies and you peel back the bark, you can see all these channels where those larvae have gone back and forth and eaten their way into that cambium layer. The adult can lay 40 to 200 eggs in bark crevices on the tree. And they hatch, and then the following year, during the year, the larvae eat their way around and they eventually pupate and then chew their way out through those exit holes you see. The adult doesn't live very long. So most of the damage on with this critter is done by the larva. And so, as I say, they can live 40 to 70 eggs in a certain place. The larva burrows itself into the tree and it goes into this layer here where the mineral water and the nutrients and stuff go back and up and down in the tree. They remain there for 1 to 2 years, and then they pupate and chew their way out. And so then the process begins all over again. There are several other bright green beetles that you might find in your garden, but generally they are not the emerald ash borer. Like I say, the adults, you don't see these very often. And if we wouldn't move wood around, this ash borer would make a very, very, very slow progression across the landscape, but we have enabled it to go quite quickly from one place to another. It's been found in 35 states and 5 Canadian provinces. The federal EAB quarantine covers much of the eastern United States, and there are some instances in South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado. It was first found in Wisconsin in July of 2008 in southeast Wisconsin, and in southwest Wisconsin in April of 2009, Brown County in July of 2009. And since then, infestations have been discovered throughout the southern half of Wisconsin and also in several northern counties. What's interesting is if you look at a map where these infestations are, oftentimes they're very near big state parks where people have brought firewood. And so one of the things you can do to control that, if people want to control it, is to not move firewood. EAB is expected to wipe out 99% of the ash trees in the future. If you remember Dutch elm disease from several, well, more than several years ago, probably 20, 25, 30 years ago, you will see that the elm trees are pretty much non-existent in Wisconsin. Once in a while, you'll see one out in the middle of a field all by itself, beautiful big elm tree. But where the elms are close together, they've been pretty much wiped out by the Dutch elm disease. Why is that a concern? I mean, what's with the ash trees? Well, they make up 7 to 20% of Wisconsin trees. probably 7 in rural natural areas and 20% in cities. When the Dutch elm disease went through, many of the trees that were replacing the elm trees were ash trees. And so now we're going to be losing the ash trees. The ash wood is a really valuable wood for baseball bats, flooring, cabinets, tool handles, and many other projects. Not only is the loss of the wood for those products, but dead ash trees are a blight on the landscape. If you have driven down towards southeastern Wisconsin, where it's pretty much widely spread, you see a lot of dead ash trees, and it just looks really, really bad because you see all these dead trees in what should be a nice, vibrant forest. One of the things that happens is a dead ash becomes brittle very quickly, and it's a real safety hazard to homeowners and landowners. Arborists really do not like to take care of dead ash trees because of the safety hazard it is for anyone that's cutting down these trees. So, you know, if your ash is dying, the thing is get rid of it sooner rather than later. Also, the effect of taking away one species of trees is we reduce the biodiversity. Any insects or birds or other animals that relied on ash trees now do not have that tree in their repertoire of places to eat and use for shelter and that sort of thing. Signs of infection in an ash tree, it's going to probably be infected. There'll be larvae in it for a few years before it starts showing a lot of signs. Some of the first things you'll probably notice is that the canopy is thinning and dying. The leaves are small and pale. You may also notice a lot of woodpeckers pecking at the tree. Small branches start to die back. It starts sprouting along the base of the tree, right along the bottom of the trunk, because it's not getting the nutrients anymore up to the top of the tree. So it's trying desperately to re-sprout on the lower levels where it thinks it has a chance to grow. This attacks white, black, and green ash, but not mountain ash. Mountain ash is a whole different species of trees, so that's not affected. The trees will usually die in a few years, and of course they'll die faster if the number of larvae in the under the trunk is greater. There's really not much you can do if your tree has this. By the time you notice that it's declining, first and foremost, what you can do to control it though and keep it from spreading is do not move the ash wood unless it's been debarked and completely dead. This means 2 years of aging in place before you would take that and move it for anything like firewood or that sort of thing. Firewood bans are in effect in all of Wisconsin counties. Buy your firewood when you get to your campsite and don't leave extra wood at your campsite. An experimental wasp is being tried in some areas. That's a parasite of the beetle or the larva. And what that means is it lays its eggs on this emerald ash borer, and the eggs hatch and consume the emerald ash borer. That's their host when they're little. It's not widespread use yet, and it would take a long time for us to have enough numbers of those to actually have a dent in the spread of the emerald ash borer. Chemical treatments for ash trees are the most widespread treatment, and you have to start before the tree has declined too badly. Insecticide treatments may be in the form of a soil drench, or they can be injected into the tree. Usually an arborist has to do this injection. They drill a small hole and then they give the tree a shot, basically, and then inject the insecticide into the tree, into that vascular layer. Let's see. Before you decide to treat, you have to decide if the tree is worth saving. Does the tree have ornamental value? We have an ash tree in our backyard that we are treating because it's a huge tree and it shades the south side of our house and provides a shaded lawn for us to enjoy all summer. So we decided we're going to try to save that tree as long as we can. Is the tree still healthy? If it's showing significant signs of being infected, it's usually not salvageable. You have to consider the cost. The treatment must be repeated every 1 to 3 years for the life of the tree. So this is a long-term commitment, and you have to be ready to say, oh, I'm going to do this for the life of the tree or for my life or however long I live here. How big is the tree? Is it something that can be treated with a soil drench, or does it have to be treated with an insecticide injection? And how many trees are we talking about? Obviously, this is not something that you can do to a whole woodlot, but you may be able to do it to a selected tree or two in your yard. Is it a do-it-yourself project, or must you hire a tree service? Is there a known infestation within 15 miles of where your tree is? If it's greater than 15 miles away, you probably don't have to treat yet at this time. And again, there's another publication in that resource list to help you decide whether to treat a tree or to remove the tree. So that's kind of the story on the emerald ash borer. The next one we're going to talk about is jumping worms, and this is kind of a newer one. They've been in Wisconsin a shorter time. No, they do not actually jump, but they do move vigorously. I don't know if you know, but all worms in Wisconsin are invasive. There are no native earthworms in Wisconsin. The last of the earthworms were wiped out during the last ice age, when the glaciers literally scoured the face of Wisconsin, and there was no place for the worms to go, so they all died out. The worms we have here have been introduced from Europe, so we might call them European earthworms to differentiate between those and the jumping worms. We usually think of worms as helping garden and soil crops, but they are actually harmful to forests. There's a 2-minute video in the Wisconsin DNR resources section of the first link under jumping worms in the resource listings that gives a really, really good description of why worms are not good things to have in forests. Basically what happens is they eat all of the litter on the forest floor, and that's necessary for young trees to have cover and sprout. And when you don't have that cover, you don't get regeneration in forests. So some things to remember is don't toss out your fishing worm bait into waterways or on the ground in wooded areas. Put it in the trash, or take it home, and if you want to, put it in your garden, but don't put it into natural areas when you're done fishing. Jumping worms are different from the European earthworms because they feed, reproduce, and the effects they have on soil and structure is totally different than the European earthworms. They grow more rapidly, reduce more quickly, and consume many more nutrients than the other earthworms we have. Once the worms become established, they quickly transform soil into dry, granular pellets with a texture like discarded coffee grounds. This altered soil structure is often unaccommodating to ornamental and garden plants and inhospitable to many native plant species. In many cases, invasive species thrive where the jumping worms live. And what happens, what they do is they excrete, the castings of the worms are much larger and coarser than our native earthworm castings. They don't hold water and nutrients like soil does, and therefore they are not conducive to plants growing well in those areas. Some people also call these jumping worms or crazy worms. They come from East Asia. They are parthenogenic, which means they do not need a male and a female to reproduce. One worm can reproduce by itself. They can have 2 generations per year. You can see that the eggs are very small. It would be very, very hard to pick eggs out of soil if you have the worms, literally impossible. And a newly hatched worm is, barely more than 2 centimeters long. So they're very, very tiny. The problem is the cocoons are often in soil that is moved by people. And so that's how they have been getting around. Some differences when you look at them. The jumping worm on the left is kind of more of a brownish gray color, whereas an earthworm, European nightcrawler, is more pinkish or reddish. The body of a jumping worm is sleek, smooth, dry, and firm, whereas the bodies of earthworms are kind of thick and slimy and floppy. The jumping worms thrash violently when they're disturbed, and they move like a snake, kind of that S pattern. If you get them really agitated, they will actually shed a portion of the tail, and that will keep wiggling, and it doesn't produce another worm, but it kind of keeps wiggling and thrashing also. It's kind of creepy. Earthworms generally wiggle and stretch when they're disturbed. They may also coil up into a ball, but they don't do the S movement pattern of a snake like the jumping worms do. The mature jumping worm is maybe a little bit smaller than most earthworms. And one of the key things is this part here called the clitellum. In the jumping worm, this is flush with the body. It isn't extended up, or there's no bump there. It's relatively close to the head. It's within the first 15 segments or so of the head of the worm. On the European nightcrawler, the clitellum is pink or red, and it's slightly raised from the rest of the body, and it doesn't go all the way around like the jumping worms does. So these are 2 of the other clues that you can, if you look closely at the worm, you can pretty easily tell whether it's a jumping worm or not. Their life cycle, the tiny worms hatch from the cocoon eggs in the spring of the year. They take a while to grow. They feed and grow for the summer months, and you probably won't see a lot of evidence of them until the middle to the late summer. At that point, the worms are mature, they reproduce, they deposit their cocoons into the surroundings. And when it first freezes in the fall, the adult worms die. At least we think. We have not seen any that have survived the Wisconsin winter. The eggs are in the ground during the cold months, protected in their cocoons, about the size of mustard seeds or smaller. And then in April or May in the spring, they start the life cycle all over again. They live in the top few inches of soil, or actually on the surface litter. Like we said, they're voracious eaters. They can produce 2 generations a year if they want to. They consume all the leaf litter, the mulch, and all the organic soil nutrients in that top inch or 2 of soil. The castings are really coarse and kind of look like coffee grounds. So if you suddenly notice that there's not much mulch, there's not a lot of litter in your garden, and you wonder what's going on, and you look closer and the ground looks like real grainy, like coffee grounds, it's a pretty good clue that you have the jumping worms, even though you might not see the worms themselves. The castings are very poor at holding water and nutrients. The lack of leaf litter inhibits seed germination in gardens and forests, and the lack of soil nutrients makes for very poor plant growth. Some of the things that you can do to control jumping worms, there is nothing you can do that you can use for sure to get rid of them. Educate yourself on others about how they are spread. The biggest way to spread them is by moving plants, soil, or mulch from an area where the worms are to an area where they aren't. And most of the people that I know of that have them, I know they are in Wisconsin Rapids. They were first found on the Madison Arboretum campus, the campus of the Madison Campus Arboretum. And they got them, they think, from plants that were brought into the Arboretum. The people in Wisconsin Rapids also suspect they had plants that were bought in Madison area and brought up here. And they had the either the worms in the soil in the pot, or the cocoons were in the soil. Inspect plants before you purchase and buy bare root plants if possible. That's not always possible because we can't go to garden places and, you know, expect to find bare root tomato plants. But the industry, the plant industry has becoming aware of this and are trying to control them. Do not share plants with other gardeners. There are, you know, if you were to take the plant out, completely wash off all the roots of all soil and everything, and then repot in sterile potting soil, you could probably get away with sharing. But the thing is, most people don't do that. And so the best thing is, don't share plants with other gardeners. Even if someone gives you a plant and then you take it to your house and clean off the roots and everything, you're still possibly bringing those cocoons into your area. Be sure to clean off your boots, your tools, your tires when moving from one area to another when you're gardening. This is something that you are maybe going to have to ask landscapers about if they come and do work on your property. What are they doing to control the spread of the jumping worms? Inquire when you buy mulch and compost. Ask the seller what protocols they follow to treat the product for pathogens. If they kind of look at you and say, huh, I wouldn't buy from that seller. They are not treating them for jumping worms. There's protocols that sellers or producers of compost and mulch have to follow so that they don't spread other diseases and stuff through the mulch and the compost. And those protocols would probably also take care of the cocoons. Generally, it involves hot composting or heating the compost or mulch before it's sold. If you have them, take care not to spread them to other people or other areas on your property. So that means, you know, being really sure that you clean off boots and tools, garden tools and all that sort of thing, and don't rake leaves from one area to another. Don't move mulch from one area to another. And so these are the basic ways that you can control them. There's no pesticide that will treat infested soil, so don't apply any product to try to control them. You can experiment with plants that might tolerate the soil changes. In fact, the UW is doing a study now to try and find plants that would likely be, people would likely be able to plant in areas infested with jumping worms. So they're interested to know if you have them and you've got plants that are doing well in an area where the worms are, they would be very interested in knowing what kind of plants you're planting there, that they can let others know that, you know, this plant works in a soil that's invaded by the jumping worms. If you have them and you see them, pick and destroy them. Some people have tried to solarize the soil to reduce the numbers. And what that means is to lay a piece of clear plastic over bare soil for several days. It has to maintain a temperature of 104 degrees for, I believe it's 3 days. I'm just checking my notes here. Yeah, 104 degrees for at least 3 days. Now that's difficult to do in Wisconsin because to have 3 days of bright sunshine in a row, first of all, is sometimes kind of rare in Wisconsin. And to get the soil up to that temperature is not an easy thing to do. There is a mustard drench, it's called, that will help you determine if you have the jumping worms. You mix 1/3 cup of dry mustard in a gallon of water, clean a square foot area of the litter and mulch on top of it, and pour half of the mixture on the soil. Wait a minute and then pour the rest of the mixture over that soil. If you have any jumping worms, they will rise to the top because that mustard irritates the skin on the jumping worms. In fact, you'll get all the worms to come to the top. But then you can look to see if you have any jumping worms or to hand pick and destroy those. And that might be one way to help control, or at least to see whether or not you have jumping worms in an area that you suspect you might. Another one that's worth trying but not really well researched is to add diatomaceous earth into the soil where the jumping worms. It kind of irritates the worms, but they may just move to another place. So that's not a really good solution either. Another one that we've had that has been on the rise lately in central Wisconsin and just driving some people to fits. If you are a lily lover and a lily grower, you may have seen this already, and if you haven't, it will probably be around soon. It's called a lily leaf beetle. It attacks true lilies and fritillaries, and to a lesser extent, lily of the valleys and Solomon seal. It doesn't attack daylilies, canna lilies, or calla lilies. The bug is really easy to see. It's fire engine red, as you can see in the picture on the bottom. It's a bright red beetle. It has 1 generation a year. The adults can live for several years. The adults chew holes in the plant, but they're not the biggest destroyer. It's actually the larvae that do great destruction. The eggs are kind of a reddish brown color. They're laid in a line on the underside of a leaf, often following a vein, and they will hatch in 4 to 8 days. These are the little larvae that really do destruction on plants. If they lay a couple of those on a leaf, by the time they are ready to pupate, they will have stripped that whole leaf and there'll be nothing left of it, and they may have moved on to other leaves on the same plant. The female can lay 250 to 450 eggs. You won't see the larvae themselves. It looks like a piece of a black blob, and what it actually is they cover themselves with their own excrement. So it appears as this black blob. It's really gross. They feed for 2 to 3 weeks and reach a 1/2 inch long. Then they drop off into the ground, pupate for 16 to 22 days, and then they emerge again to feed as adults until fall. The adults are strong flyers. They can go quite a distance. The grub itself, if you look underneath all that black stuff, is kind of a tan, and it looks like kind of like a little slug or a little snail in appearance. Whoops. Yep. Okay. What can you do to control these? Whoopsie, we went one too far. Hand pick the adults and the larvae and drop them into soapy water. If you look under there and you can find the eggs, crush those, because you'll be getting to them before they even start doing any damage to the lily leaves. They also attack the flowers too, so it's not just the leaves. I had a neighbor who just loved her lilies, and after one summer of trying to battle these things, she tore them all out. And that's a likely thing you might want to do if you don't want to keep battling them. Insecticides containing carbaryl, cyfluthrin, cypermethrin, deltamethrin, Lambda-cyhalothrin, permethrin, and zetacypermethrin can control the beetles. Those are synthetic insecticides. Organics are listed there. Spinosad is an organic that's becoming more widely used. And you can also use horticultural oils and insecticidal soap, especially on the grub stage of them. But again, the same is true with the Japanese beetles. Both the organic and the chemical pesticides are harmful to pollinators. And so it's not a good solution to use in a garden setting if you have other plants that are being pollinated by any of our various pollinating insects. And as I said, if you really can't stand it anymore, you may have to switch to a different flower because lily leaf beetle, like I say, they can go pretty far, they can spread, and they can go from one neighborhood to another. These are some invasive species that are around in the United States, but not real widespread yet here in Wisconsin, but you might be hearing about them. A spotted lanternfly, and the adult, when there's a whole bunch of them and they're resting, they look like these white spots, and they're maybe half an inch or a little bit bigger. When they open the wings up, they have some really pretty red underwings with spots on them and some black edges on the lower wings. The nymphs, or the young ones, look like these on the bottom, black or red with spots on them. The main thing that they do is they're a sap-sucking insect. And so they suck the sap from stems and branches and trunks of plants. And when they do this, they also create an opening for pathogens to get into the plants and cause disease. They produce a lot of sticky excrement called honeydew. Aphids sometimes do this too. And this in turn then is a host for black sooty mold. So you might see your plants starting to be covered by this black kind of powdery looking stuff that doesn't really come off when you shake it. Their preferred host tree is tree of heaven, which is a invasive species also, but they will feed on over 100 different species, and also some of our produce plants like grapes, hops, apples, stone fruit, cherries, maples, walnuts, and willows. So it's something that's not widespread yet, but it could be coming in the future. Another one is called a brown marmorated stink bug. It has sucking mouth parts, again, that pierce the leaves of fruit and trees and wide variety of vegetable garden plants and that sort of thing. They stink when crushed, hence their name, and they like to hibernate inside over winter. Let's see. Some of the things that happen, like if it feeds on apples, it gets what's called cat facing, and it will have like surface blemishes and stuff, and it makes the fruit unmarketable. Not that it's bad to eat, but it just doesn't look good, so it's hard to sell. And it also causes rot in a lot of fruits because they puncture the skin of the fruit, and then of course other things get in and damage the fruit. When they come inside the house in the wintertime, they can have a really stinking odor and can make indoor settings inhospitable. They cause allergic reactions to some people who are sensitive to them. And the bug's frass or poop can stain walls and curtains. And if they are squeezed or vacuumed up, they emit that stinky vapor that makes it really challenging to live with. So that's not one that we really want to see either. And not only does it attack plants, but it's also like the Asian lady beetles that want to get in your house, and the box elder beetles in the fall. This next one is called a spotted wing Drosophila, and it's a vinegar fly similar to fruit flies and about that same size. The males have that spot on the end of the wings, you can see here. And the females have an ovipositor, which is a egg-laying appendage, but she doesn't have spots on the wings. They attack soft fruits like blueberries, strawberries, raspberries. And what happens is they lay the eggs inside the fruit. Here's my, okay, and then you get this little worm. This is a worm on a raspberry. And the eggs hatch in as little as 1 to 3 days. So you don't have a lot of time from the time they lay it until they start hatching. They can pupate in the damaged fruit then, and or in the top layers of leaf litter around the infested plants. And because they have such a short life cycle, like fruit flies, they can multiply like overnight. It's doesn't take much time at all to get them to quite big numbers. So in summary, when we talk about invasives, they are often brought to our area by humans, moving them from their native habitat for commercial reasons or by accident. So sometimes it's on purpose. It might be like you want to bring in a particular plant, like the one that comes with the tree of heaven, that is an invasive plant, and we may have moved the insect with it when it was brought here. Once here, they are hard to control because they have no natural enemies, and they often outcompete natives for that reason. Some are treatable, but many can merely be controlled to prevent their spread. And education is the best weapon we have to control the spread of invasives. It's something we all have to be aware of, and we all have to be willing to kind of keep a lookout for these plants. Things like not moving firewood, we had talked about that. And, you know, not moving plants so that we move the jumping worms, that sort of thing. We've gotten more questions about jumping worms in the last 2 years than we've probably had of any other thing as master gardeners, because it's rather new and they are around. I always include in my talks where you can get good resource information when you have questions about things. Enter the name of the invasive species or any other thing that you want to be researching into your search engine and include the word extension after the name. So lily leaf beetle extension would be an example. And this is what I did when I prepare these talks, because that brings up to the top of your search list university-based research articles. And so you don't have to go down pages and pages and pages to find something that's really relevant, well-researched, and you know that it's going to work. Then you're going to get a list of articles from different universities and states all around the United States. Look for articles from UW Wisconsin or states near Wisconsin or that have a similar type of growing conditions. For example, Michigan, Iowa, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, they're kind of in the same growing zone and have similar types of plants and things. And articles from those states are likely to be valid also for Wisconsin. The advantage of using these articles from university-based sites is that they have reliable, tested information, as opposed to commercial sites, which are trying to sell you a product usually, or blog posts. And these are just people who are out there and, you know, sitting down at the computer and writing about something, and they haven't really researched it. They might have been lucky to have something work once, and so now they think it's a wonder cure for it. And it really wasn't the cure because something else intervened in the meantime. So researching, use those university researched sites in order to find answers to questions. And I said earlier, we were going to talk a little bit about buckthorn. I usually try to include an invasive species or two in my talks every month. Buckthorn, there are two basic kinds that are pretty prevalent in Wisconsin. There's glossy buckthorn, where the leaves are a little bit more shiny, and there's common buckthorn. So glossy buckthorn is it's up here, the top and the middle, and both kinds have abundant dark bluish to black berries or fruits on them. They have a yellow vascular material. You can see a little bit of the yellow around the edge here. And then when you get further into the branch or trunk, there's orangish colored wood. They also have black roots, which is a kind of a giveaway if you have a small one and you pull it up. The branches and the trunks have lenticels on them, which are small, horizontal, lightly colored areas. Peach, plums and cherries also have this kind of thing, but if it's on something that you obviously don't recognize the fruit on it, and other plants do too, but that's a distinguishing characteristic of buckthorn. And it's so named because the end of the branch has this, not really a thorn, it's not really sharp or anything, but it looks like a thorn, or some people say it looks like a buck's hoof. And so they call it a buckthorn plant. It's also often has multiple stems coming from a base. It can get up to 20 feet tall. It's early to leaf out before many of our other native plants. And like I said, if you walk through the woods now, the buckthorn will probably still have green leaves on it. It takes over open wooded areas like crazy, spreads really fast, and the fruits cause diarrhea in birds, leading to a widespread, far and wide. And so I see this all over in town and out in the country and the woods. And it's very hard to control because of the spread with the birds and the berries and all that kind of stuff. So that ends our program for tonight, and we'll see if we have any questions here. I will stop my program and close that up, and we'll see once if we can answer any questions.
Yeah, so far we just have one, and it's, is there any of these insects that can't be fed to chickens after hand picking?
You probably should. Oh, hello? Hello, am I still on?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I lost the screen here. I know that they will eat the Japanese beetles. And I guess you would have to probably ask a poultry expert more than a gardening expert, but if you can get your chickens to eat them, I would think that they, probably wouldn't hurt. Chickens eat all kinds of insect things. So I don't know of any that, I don't think that they are poisonous. None of them are really poisonous, I don't think, to people or animals. Yep, hand picking is probably the best thing to, especially if you're concerned about pollinators, which we want to be concerned about that too, because they actually are our bread and butter if we want to keep eating on this planet. Any other questions? Any gardening questions at all? Also, any requests or suggestions for future programs? Well, I am always open to other suggestions for programs. We won't have a garden guru in December because it would fall the week of Christmas. So that's a little close and everybody's a little bit busy, but hopefully we'll be back in January. Have I grown hops? No, I have not. I really don't know much about hops, but again, if you go type in growing hops in Wisconsin extension and see if you can get an answer there, something online. Otherwise, contact the horticulture educator or the agriculture educator in your county at the extension office. Any other questions?
I don't know. We kind of have a quiet crew. I had a few people. Oh, there's a recommendation of a future program on native flowers.
Native flowers. Okay, I think we did one not too long ago, but it's worth repeating because we're really encouraging people to grow more native plants. They're so much better for the pollinators and the environments, and it's just all around much better for our whole ecosystem and everything. So yeah, we can delve into another one on native flowers. And there's so many different kinds. There's a native flower that grows under almost any other condition, from really wet ground to really dry ground to shade to sun. So it's not hard to put them into your landscape.
I know I had a few offered up to me lately too. One like on gardening tools.
Okay.
And like how to like where to take them or how to sharpen them or what you really need and what are some uses of gardening tools instead of having to buy every single one that you see.
Sure. Sure.
And then lawn care actually came up in discussion too. Just, helping your lawn out as much as you can naturally.
Yep. Yep. I think I did one about a year ago on lawn care, but again, it's worth repeating because almost everybody has a lawn, at least some lawn. We'd like you to plant it all in native flowers. No, not really, but.
And then somebody else had said about hydroponic gardening.
Okay, that's probably beyond most people for home gardens, unless you've got a lot of space and considerable resources.
Yeah,
it's an interesting concept, though. I mean, you can do it on a smaller scale. Probably.
I think that's what they were kind of meaning is like you can buy those kits now and do like a small scale one.
Yeah.
But all right. Is there any more questions out there? Oh, I think that's it. You had lots of thank yous, Donna. You had it really interesting. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for the information about Japanese beetles. And one of the attendees said that she no longer uses the traps, but found covering her raspberries with netting really helped this year to keep them off.
That's true, especially if you've got a crop where you can cover it. It's not so big. My pole beans are kind of hard to cover, so I just kind of pick them off. But yeah, if you have, like I said, if you're trying to protect roses, like you want to pick them and bring them in the house, and that sort of thing, covering a plant, with netting of some kind has to be pretty fine because the beetles are about a half an inch. So you can't have a big wide square thing like bird netting, but a finer netting. Yeah, that works.
All right. Well, I think we're done. How about you, Donna?